Welcome everyone. This is Juliette Homer with the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory. Welcome to today's webinar, Distribution System Planning, State Examples by Topic. I am joined today by two excellent colleagues, Alan Cook from Pacific Northwest National Laboratory and Lisa Schwartz from Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. So I'll now briefly introduce you to each of the presenters. First, Alan Cook will present. He's a senior economist at PNNL, and he is currently researching grid-related topics, including industry trends in distribution systems planning, the need for increasing coordination between utility resource planning and distribution planning, the treatment of batteries in resource planning, and the use of benefit cost analysis for valuing distributed energy resources. Next, Lisa Schwartz will talk, and she's the deputy leader of the Electricity Markets and Policy Group at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. She manages the Energy Efficiency Team, State Technical Assistance, the Future Electric Utility Regulation Report Series, and training for public utility commissions on distribution system planning. Previously, she was the director of the Oregon Department of Energy, where earlier in her career, she was a senior policy analyst. She also served for 7 years at the Oregon Public Utility Commission. And lastly, I'll address you, and I'm Juliette Homer, a senior energy research engineer at PNNL, and I specialize in grid modernization, energy planning, and policy and regulation. I also formerly worked as a staff member at the Oregon Public Utility Commission, and my work at PNNL supports national and international projects in the area of integrated energy planning, advanced distribution system planning, and grid modernization. So now I'd like to have some acknowledgements. First, I'd like to acknowledge the U.S. Department of Energy Solar Energy Technologies Office, who has funded this work as part of a project to provide in-depth, impactful analytical support to state public utility commissions. So the report on which this webinar is based was developed as part of an analytical support project for the Oregon Public Utility Commission. So we'd also like to thank and acknowledge them. In addition, this research builds on work that was funded by the Grid Modernization Lab Consortium, which is a joint effort between the U.S. Department of Energy's Office of Electricity Delivery and Energy Reliability and Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy Office at DOE. And we'd also like to acknowledge National Renewable Energy Laboratory, who is part of our team for the GMLC work. And then as you'll see on the slide here, there's links to two reports on this topic. One is the GMLC report, and the second is the report that this webinar is based on. So now I'll turn it over to Alan Cook, who will start the presentation.
Thank you, Juliette. My job today is to introduce our report, to talk a little tiny bit about what we did, how we did it, and then to dive into three specific areas: the vision statements, goals and objectives, distribution planning, and grid modernization. So I'm going to just launch right into this. To start with, part of our guiding ideas here when we put this report together was that we understand that states work within different contexts. States have statutory requirements. At the bottom of the page, you see Assembly Bill 2868, which is a bill in California that requires utilities to acquire battery storage. And that's just one of the many bills in California that form the statutory context in California. Other states have completely different statutory contexts. There's regulatory requirements that form part of the context, and there are plainly and simply differences among utilities in terms of their resource mix, in terms of how many, what percentage of renewables they're seeing. All this forms a context, which means that what works in one state or what works for one utility in one state won't necessarily work for utilities or for other states in general. So what we looked at as we put this together was we tried to identify contexts and approaches that work. So you'll see summarized in our report approaches that work in aggressive statutory contexts with high penetrations of renewables. We'll talk about approaches that work in other contexts. There are states that have requirements for storm hardening. There are states with statutes that allow utilities to have distribution investment rate riders. We tried to focus on finding approaches that work in pretty much any context. As Juliet mentioned, the GMLC report from 2017 was foundational. That report asked the question of what is going on within states. So it was organized by state. When we started working on this newer project, we realized that having some of the same material but organized by planning approach would make it far more easy to use. So the current report is organized by planning approach, and it has been updated with new material since sometime in November of 2017 when we put our pencils down on that last report. I should mention that both reports cover 15 states plus the District of Columbia, which is another way of saying they don't cover all 50 states. I'm going to leap to the next slide here, which shows Table 1 from the report. Table 1 is the roadmap. What it shows is the planning approach that we would be referring to in a particular section of the report, say grid modernization planning, and which states actually are doing and have requirements related to grid modernization. I don't want to go into this slide too much because it is straight out of the report, and it's probably a saying test for many folks on the webinar. But this is the roadmap. So now I'm going to leap into some of the substantive material from the report, starting with vision statements, goals and objectives. In the report, we summarize the vision statements or goals or objectives, or in some cases, definitions that sound a lot like vision statements from processes within several of the states. The point here is that it really is important to have a vision or some objectives, so as you move down the line, you can stay on track and you can guide your process. And we pulled out some examples. I'm going to show you two of these examples. Minnesota took a very interesting approach when they started their process. They guided their process by asking three basic questions. I don't plan to read these three questions to you, but I want to focus on the second of the three, which is, are the planning processes aligned to ensure future reliability, efficient use of resources, maximize customer benefits, and successful implementation of public policy? The reason that one is interesting to me is because they capture several themes that are very common to many states. And in fact, if you look at the next one from Maryland, where they started their process to ensure that electric distribution systems in Maryland are customer-centered, affordable, reliable, and environmentally sustainable, you see some of the same themes coming out. These themes including customers. A lot of this, what we see going on in terms of grid modernization, in terms of distribution planning, in terms of all of the distribution planning approaches, it's focused on customers, making sure that customers are given some of the alternatives, some of the options that they're looking for, maximizing customer benefits. Of course, reliability is the next major theme. Keeping the lights on is every bit as important, maybe even more so as we start looking to the future with grid modernization. As you start seeing more and more renewable resources like solar voltaics going into the distribution grids, it becomes more and more of a challenge to keep those systems balanced. So reliability becomes more and more of a key, which is why these processes are focusing on reliability. Affordability is every bit as important as anything else, because one of the things that we try to do in this country is to make sure that everyone can afford electricity, energy. Efficiency is another one that comes up and is common to the vision statements and goals, objectives of many of these states' processes. I don't think you have to go back too many years into the past to find a time when solar PV was not considered to be as much of a resource as you see it being considered today. Now, these processes are really looking at trying to gain the efficiency, basically treating them as a resource just like anything else and maximizing the efficiency of the distributed resources. And the final common theme that you see in the goals and the vision statements and the objectives from states across the country is implementing policies, which is to say a lot of these are intended to help utilities within the state to meet the renewable portfolio standards that have been put forth. In some cases, the RPS are very aggressive. I think Hawaii set a goal of 100% renewable energy. I don't remember exactly the year, but it's something like 2030 or 2040. That's very aggressive. So a big part of what you see when you look at the goals and the objectives of grid modernization projects or some of the distribution planning projects around the country in the states, it's geared towards helping implement these policies. I'm going to move on to the next of my three substantive subjects, which would be distribution planning. Talk a little tiny bit about kind of leading edge considerations. It probably doesn't need to be said, but I'm going to say it anyway. Of course, utilities have been doing distribution planning forever. Distribution planning is not a new endeavor. There are some pieces of it, however, that are going to be new. The traditional pieces of distribution planning that have been done forever, making sure you have enough capacity, making sure that you know where growth is going to occur in the distribution grid so you can direct your growth of your distribution grid into that population growth area, making sure that you have what you need to keep the voltage and frequency within bounds. That's all going to continue into the future. What will be new is the resources that will be needed for balancing some of the new distributed resources like solar. Another thing that's new and that we are seeing more of, and you'll find many examples of this in our report, is that states are starting to require utilities to file distribution plans. In the past, utilities have done the distribution plans, and stakeholders, whether it be a commission or whether it be customer groups or whether it just be customers in general, they will see parts of the plan. When a utility comes in for a general rate case, for example, they would include their capital improvement plan for the distribution system. That might be all that the stakeholders would ever see. And what we're saying now are commissions requiring utilities to file a complete plan. And this is for several reasons. One of which is simply getting greater visibility into the plan. The Michigan Commission, for example, approved a couple of rate requests, approved the capital expenditures within that, but then said, while we support and agree with your goal of reliability, we would like more information about how you arrived at this capital improvement plan, so we're going to require you to submit distribution plans. So part of what you're saying is requirements to submit these things just for visibility purposes. Other utilities, I'm going to jump to California, they have required distribution planning for a number of reasons. A big reason being stakeholder involvement. As you'll hear later on from Lisa or Juliet, there are non-wires alternatives that are being explored, and by putting those plans out where customers and other stakeholders can see them, the distribution plan forms the basis for this. So not only is it visibility, but it's also stakeholder involvement that we're saying this for. I'm going to leave that for now. There's a lot more information about distribution planning. This is just a couple of the leading edge considerations, and I'm going to talk briefly about grid modernization. Table 1, the roadmap that I mentioned earlier, shows that 5 states have grid modernization requirements. I focused a little tiny bit on Hawaii here just by pulling out what they asked their utilities to include in a grid modernization plan when they required the plan. I don't have the time to really dive into each one of these. I Would mention grid-facing technologies basically ask the question of how are you going to meter the system, how are you going to control the system. Customer-facing would be metering and equipment in the house to send signals to the customers. I think the rest of them are fairly self-explanatory. Just to finish the story of Hawaii, they did file a grid modernization plan in 2017. You would find a hot link to that plan in our report. They also filed a new and very interesting, innovative approach where they attempt to integrate customer distribution, transmission, and bulk power planning. Very interesting. It's a new filing. I don't know where it's going to go in the future, but I found it fascinating to see that. Several other states are engaging in processes. They haven't resulted in requirements yet, so there is more to come. And with that, our next speaker is Lisa Schwartz from Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory.
Thanks, Alan. I'm going to talk about 3 topics today: hosting capacity analysis, non-wires alternatives, and voluntary planning and surcharges. So Alan's potting up my slides. I'm going to dive in here. I'm on slide 2 on hosting capacity analysis. So this is simply the amount of distributed energy resources that can be interconnected under current conditions without infrastructure upgrades, with the existing control and protection systems, and the amount that won't adversely impact power quality or reliability. So some states require regulated utilities to do this: California, Hawaii, Minnesota, and New York. And some utilities have done it on their own. PEPCO has quite a detailed process and uses it for interconnection. So I'm not an engineer, but my friends who are engineers tell me that there are 4 main power system criteria that we need to pay attention to when we're trying to determine how much solar PV and other distributed resources can we interconnect down at a feeder level, at a section of a feeder, and that's thermal, power quality and voltage, protection and reliability, and safety. So you can see this graph that shows the range of hosting capacity for overvoltage violations for this example. And green means go. Green means all penetrations are acceptable, regardless of location. Yellow means, some penetrations are acceptable, it depends where. And red means just no. So hosting capacity is often just for solar PV, but also can include storage and other distributed resources, as the California utilities are doing. Next slide, please. So there are a host of methodologies that can be used. Let's start with the detailed analyses. They come in kind of 2 flavors. The first is iterative. So these are power flow simulations that are conducted at each node of the distribution system. And they repeat the analysis until they start seeing the violations occurring in these different power system criteria. So the California utilities are using this approach now, and so is PEPCO on the East Coast. So that's iterative. Stochastic is the other type of detailed analysis, and as piloted by the Electric Power Research Institute, they use many simulations, such as different sizes of solar PV in different locations on the feeder, to try to band the uncertainty of what the feeder or segment can actually host. And then there are more streamlined approaches. So these use simplified algorithms for each power system limitation to estimate when violations would occur. A couple of the California utilities initially used this method, and EPRI's Drive tool, which is a combination of the streamlined approach and stochastic approach, is what Xcel Energy in Minnesota and the New York utilities are currently using. And there are also shorthand equations that have been researched. But really the choices for modeling depend on how you're going to use the information. And there are important considerations, including how robust does the analysis need to be? What's the geographic scope within the distribution system? And how often do you have to refresh the results to reflect changes in circuits? So I think the point here is that the methods and tools continue to evolve and get more accurate and be able to better reflect different system typologies. Next slide, please. So there are 3 use cases that I'm going to lay out here. first is for development. So this is really to what we see mostly to provide information on locations where interconnection costs may be lower. So in the map I showed on the prior slide, those are the green areas of the map, right? So if you develop projects in those areas, your interconnection costs are going to be lower. The screening process for interconnection is going to go quicker. The second use case is really explicitly for the interconnection technical screening process. So we have some existing rules of thumb that are used in some locales, and we can provide better basis for determining whether more detailed analysis is needed by a more detailed hosting capacity analysis. So I have a graph here, for example, that shows hosting capacity across 10 feeders. And I've got a line drawn at the 15% mark. So this is 15% of feeder peak load. And you can see that when we do detailed analysis of these 10 feeders for hosting capacity, the host capacity is actually much greater than the 15% rule of thumb in many cases, but it's actually less than 15% in some cases. And then the final use case is just for distribution planning. And this is where utilities and states could identify future constraints on the distribution grid and perhaps be more proactive with upgrades in certain locations to allow the distribution system to integrate more distributed resources. Next slide, please. So here's one state example. We explore others in the report, Minnesota. So state law requires the largest utility in the state, Xcel Energy, to conduct hosting capacity analysis. And no formal commission action is required, but the commission has weighed in on this. So Xcel has filed its first hosting capacity analysis at the end of 2016. Parties commented, staff issued briefing papers, and the commission opined on a decision and required regular analyses November 1st each year, and then provided guidance for the utility's next analysis. So this is very similar to what some state public utility commissions will do in the integrated resource planning process. It's flexible so that improvements can be made over time. And so they recommended more details that they'd like to see and some different types of analyses for the next time. So at the end of 2017, Xcel filed a second analysis, and staff and parties are going through review and commenting on that right now. Finally, staff recently filed briefing papers and proposed distribution planning requirements for all regulated utilities at April public meeting, and they included requirements for hosting capacity analysis for all utilities. For the small utilities, they're really looking for indicators for hosting capacity analysis, and in this case, specifically minimum load on feeders, which is very important for the ability to accommodate distributed resources. Next slide, please. So I'm going to move on to my second area, non-wires alternatives. So non-wires alternatives are simply energy efficiency, demand response, distributed generation, and distributed storage. And non-wires alternatives, in order to be able to defer, mitigate, or eliminate the need for traditional distribution investments, have to be able to deliver specific services at specific locations. And so I'll step through a few examples of states where they're doing this. So in New York, the Public Service Commission required utilities to identify candidate projects for non-wires alternatives, and then the utilities jointly developed 3 suitability criteria. These are the criteria that at a minimum that these non-wires alternatives would have to meet in order to be able to even be considered for deferral or avoidance of the traditional project. So the first criteria is project type, and typically projects have to be either for load relief or liability to be able to play. Second one is timeline. These projects, if they're going to substitute for traditional utility investments, have to be able to be in place, working on time. And finally, there's a cost suitability, the cost above which, pursuing non-wires alternatives may make sense because, below that, it's just not worth the transaction cost to be cost effective. And these requirements vary based on size of project, small versus large. Next slide, please. So New York utilities issue requests for proposals for non-wires alternatives, and here on this slide are examples of recent solicitations. You can see most of them are for load relief, where load is projected to surpass the capacity of the existing distribution system infrastructure. And you can see here the project sizes, in some cases, building up over time, and also the kinds of timelines that have been established. Next slide, please. In California, a recent Public Utilities Commission decision directed the regulated utilities to file annual grid needs assessments and distribution deferral opportunity reports. So these identify specific deficiencies on the distribution system, specifically what circuit, what's the deficiency, and what's the underlying cause of the deficiency, such as meeting customer growth. So these form the basis for annual lists for utility distribution projects, and a subset of those will be potential candidates for non-wires alternatives. The reports will have to discuss the prospects for distributed resources to cost-effectively defer or avoid traditional investments. And the PUC directed utilities to use technical and timing screening criteria. So in other words, the utilities will determine that a proposed investment could technically be addressed using distributed resources, and that sufficient time exists to issue a solicitation, to select bidders, and get the distributed resources in place to address the deficiency. So we'll see our first round here by December 1, where each utility in California is going to recommend these deferral projects for solicitation. Next slide, please. And finally, on this topic, in Rhode Island, they've taken a very methodical approach to encourage consideration of cost-effective alternatives to meet projected distribution system needs where they could be met by energy efficiency, demand response, and storage. So last summer, the Commission issued least cost procurement standards that provide guidance for including non-wires alternatives in these so-called system reliability procurement plans. The utility in Rhode Island, National Grid, filed its first plan last summer, and in it, they highlighted 3 cases where they can see non-wires alternatives potentially being used. 1, in highly used distribution systems, portions of the system. 2, in areas where construction may be physically constrained. And 3, in areas where the utility is anticipating demand growth. In the fall, the Commission issued a guidance document where it laid out how it will consider the utility's proposed distribution system investments. And also in fall, a joint report was issued by 3 agencies, the Public Utility Commission, the Office of Energy Resources, and the Division of Public Utilities and Carriers. And that put forward a new framework, overarching framework for the state's electric system at the request of the governor. And in that report, among other things, they note that there are significant capital investments that are persisting to address system capacity issues. In other words, circuit peaks needs are driven by load growth. Next slide, please. All right, so here's my last topic. I'm going to cover sort of the combination, as these usually are in tandem, voluntary utility planning and surcharges that can go along with it. So some states have enacted legislation that encourages utilities to accelerate grid modernization or otherwise make distribution system investments to improve safety, reliability, and resilience. And the legislation also provides utilities an opportunity for favorable cost treatment. So I'll give you a few examples here. In Illinois, a law enacted in 2011 allows utilities to voluntarily undertake infrastructure investments, and they could include smart meters, distribution automation, communication networks, grid hardening, and other investments. And at the same time, the law also requires an annual process to determine the utility's revenue requirement. And in Illinois, they're using an approach called formula rates. So that's where rates are designed to closely track the utility's cost of service. And the utility's allowed return on equity, which is often a hard-fought debate in rate cases. And a major part of the revenue requirement is simply a standard calculation that starts with the 30-year Treasury bond, and they add basis points on top of that. There's also a true-up mechanism that adjusts rates when the utility's earnings fall above or below a predefined earnings deadband. So that's Illinois, and they've seen a lot of significant investments made to upgrade the grid. In Indiana, utilities filed detailed 7-year capital investment plans for upgrading and replacing aging infrastructure for approval by the Indiana Commission. Those plans are reviewed outside of a rate case. And that examples of investments in these plans have included advanced metering, distribution automation, and advanced distribution management systems. In Maryland, the Commission used rate surcharges to allow accelerated investment to replace feeders after widespread outages in response to weather events. And finally, in Pennsylvania, certain distribution system investments can be recovered outside of a traditional rate case, but as a precondition to that, the utility has to file a long-term infrastructure improvement plan, and eligible investments have included things like replacing aging feeders, accelerating rehab of poor-performing circuits, automation that better sectionalizes the grid to reduce the impact of outages. So now that's it, and I'll turn it over to Juliet.
All right, thank you, Lisa. And as a reminder, folks can submit questions, and you can just use that questions pane, and you can submit your questions. All right, so I'm going to be talking about 3 things today. Locational value, standardization of methodologies, reporting on poor performing circuits, and then aligning multiple distribution planning processes. Okay, so first is locational value. You know, one of the things that often comes up is this question of what is the real value of rooftop solar, for instance? And the answer is really it depends. Value is very context dependent, and solar could be very valuable in one location and quite expensive in another. And California and New York are really leading when it comes to looking at and trying to understand the locational value. So in California, the distribution resource plan requirements require California utilities to require or to define criteria for assigning value to DERs, and then to identify specific locational values for DERs. New York has a value of DER proceeding that provides a framework for valuing and developing compensation methodologies. And so in New York, they have the value stack tariff, and the value stack tariff is a compensation method that takes into account previously unquantified values, including locational and environmental benefits. So first we'll talk about California. So they have a working group in California called the Locational Net Benefits Analysis Working Group. And the commission there, working with the working groups, has directed the utilities to use a consistent 2-part methodology. And first in this methodology is to calculate and to understand the system level avoided costs. And so there's a calculator that's been developed by E3 that's used to do this, and they call it the DER avoided cost calculator. And this provides an estimate of the system level avoided cost for a given DER solution. And then added to that is a second component, and this is the specific project deferral benefits. And this calculates the value of deferring specific capital projects. And then you add those 2 things together, and that results in the total achievable avoided cost for a given DER solution at a specific location. So in California, demonstration projects are underway to test the tools for locational net benefits analysis. And the completion of these final, what they call LNBA models, is expected in 2018. So the LNBA working group agreed on 2 use cases that the commission then also approved. And this is first to use locational net benefits analysis tools to come up with a public tool and a heat map. Basically something that could be posted online where people can look and understand the locational value, locational benefits of DERs in different locations. This is an online tool, and this would enable customers and developers to identify optimal locations for installing DERs. So that's kind of one use case. Another is to use locational net benefits analysis to prioritize candidates for distribution deferral opportunities for this distribution investment deferral framework that Lisa talked a little bit about before. So basically using locational benefits analysis in non-wires alternatives, essentially. And then also locational net benefits is going to be used to understand more about cost effectiveness and update the DER avoided cost tool. So the commission in California back in June 2017 directed some more refinements, and again, this is kind of a process, but some refinements to the locational net benefits methodology to look at smart inverters and the location-specific value and grid services that smart inverters can provide. Next is to look at DERs working in concert within the same substation footprint, and then improving the heat map tool, and then increase granularity, and then working with CalISO to understand transmission costs and benefits. All right, so moving on to New York. So New York's value of DER proceeding is looking at providing incentive for DERs that actually reflect the locational value. So in the short term, the VDER tariffs are intended to replace net metering for community solar PV up to 5 megawatts. And the thinking is that this will eventually be applied all across the grid. So in New York, the approach is to really identify, quantify, and compensate for, and they've broken it down into kind of two parts. One is first the demand reduction value, or DRV. So this demand reduction value applies to all projects in a utility's territory, and it's based on the utility's and average cost of service. So that's to all projects in a territory. The next piece is interesting, the locational system relief value. And so what this is that the utility is required to look across its service territory and identify areas where system relief is needed. And for projects that are located within these areas or zones, there would be additional compensation because the value provided is actually helping to fill a specific utility need in these areas. So the utilities were required to include in some implementation proposals, the way to identify, compensate for, and create caps, megawatt caps, for these locational system relief value zones. All right, so a little bit more about this. I found it very interesting. So utilities were required to determine threshold criteria. So the commission didn't tell them what the criteria was. Each utility developed its own criteria, and they said, okay, beyond, once this criteria is met, these areas are going to be identified as these LSRV zones, and then they'd have additional compensation. So some examples here, Con Edison, the way they developed their threshold for when something qualifies as a locational system relief value area is they projected energy use out to 2021. And they said, okay, any area where the energy use exceeds 98% of the current capacity in sub-transmission lines, or 98% of the current capacity in area stations, or 90% of the current capacity in the distribution networked areas. And if any of those criteria were met, it become an LSRV area. So applying that criteria, 19% of Con Edison service territory qualifies as an LSRV zone. For National Grid, the way they define their threshold is they scaled all the loads on all the distribution substations to 2020, and then they screened against their planning ratings to identify potential loadings above those ratings. And when those criteria were applied, 16% of substations were identified as LSRV areas. So key to these calculations of both the location LSRV and the DRV, which applies to all utility projects, is this marginal cost of service studies. So they're really the basis for both calculations. And as New York moves into phase 2 for VDER, a stated goal for that was to improve this marginal cost of service studies, and also to improve the LSRV methodology, and then to standardize them to the extent possible. Recognizing that symmetry across all utilities and all aspects of distribution planning isn't realistic or really even desirable, but there is this desire to kind of try and standardize these calculations to the extent possible. So that feeds nicely into this next topic I'm going to cover, which is the standardization of methods. And as we were working on these reports, we found it interesting that in certain states there really is this kind of move towards just kind of standardizing methodologies to a certain extent. And as I mentioned, the marginal cost of service and LSRV methodology in New York. But also another thing interesting there is New York utilities were required to file these distributed system implementation plans. And it was in 2 phases. The first phase, utilities would individually file plans that provided information on their current 5-year investment plans and how the individual utilities could do things immediately to help support state energy goals. Then the utilities were required to come together and jointly file what they call the supplemental DSIPs. And the supplemental DSIPs would address tools, processes, and protocols that could be jointly developed or under shared standards. And then the benefits cost analysis in New York is another example of something that was kind of a standardized process. California is the same kind of thing. The workshop process has been used to develop, or the working group process, I think that should say, has been used to develop standard tools and methodologies related to a number of items, hosting capacity analysis, locational benefits, what are the DER growth scenarios, and load forecasts. So there's actually some standard tools for doing that, DER and load forecasts. All right, then moving on. I love this picture here. So I'm going to talk about reporting on poor performing circuits. So this is actually in Calgary. This bear jumped up on this distribution pole, and turns out he woke up and climbed down safely. Probably isn't creating too many problems in the U.S. here, but states like Florida, Illinois, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Rhode Island are requiring utilities to report on the worst performing feeders. So Illinois requires annual reporting with reliability, performance, 3-year plans for future investments, and then to identify potential challenges areas in the future. Ohio also requires reports, and Pennsylvania utilities must report quarterly on the worst performing circuits and then propose investments. So bringing all this together, how are states aligning processes? There's so many different processes out there. California, Hawaii, Minnesota, Rhode Island, and Washington are all making strides in aligning planning processes. And I really like this figure on this slide where, there's so much going on in California. You feel like you hear about all these different pieces. And for me, this slide kind of showed how they all fit together. This is from an Energy Division presentation back in June of 2017. And it's really the distribution resource planning kind of framework. So you've got in the red box here, this integrated capacity analysis, which is just like the hosting capacity. So as part of the planning assumptions, it's about, okay, calculating hosting capacity at a circuit, then looking at the locational net benefits analysis at a location, and then looking at, well, what are the DER growth scenarios? From there, there's this grid needs assessment where the IOU planning document, planning departments say, okay, based on all of this, what are our forecasted grid needs based on these planning assumptions? From there, there's a grid modernization framework about kind of what technological upgrades are needed in order to integrate the DERs. And from there, that could go into a general rate case where the commission would then authorize grid modernization investments. At the same time, there's the distribution investment deferral framework, which is the non-wires alternatives piece that we talked about earlier. And then going into this integrated DER solicitation process, which authorizes the procurements of DERs for distribution deferral. So there's a lot here. This figure's in the paper if you want to learn more about it, but I thought it was nice to show how the California proceedings fit together. This is another big complex chart here, but it's from the Hawaii's recent March 2018 Integrated Grid Planning Report. And I don't want to go too much into this other than to say, there's this forecasting is the blue box on the left. So forecasting and other inputs feed into both resource planning needs as well as transmission and distribution planning needs. And then there's a 5-year resource solution sourcing and transmission and distribution sourcing, feeding into solicitations or bids, evaluation for a 5-year integrated grid plan, and then finally regulatory approval. And another thing I'd like to point out on this slide is this whole idea of stakeholder engagement. It really is a common thread that we've seen through a lot of these proceedings around the country. And I like the way Hawaii's laid it out here, where, in the green circles up on the top of the figure are public engagement. So they've kind of planned those throughout this process. And then there's also a stakeholder council that's been developed that's also meeting in the blue diamonds there shown, and it's kind of meeting throughout the process. At the same time, in the bottom in the orange, there's a forecast working group, a technical advisory panel that's feeding in all throughout this process, and then a markets working group. And then lastly, this is the integrated distribution system planning diagram that was developed as part of a Minnesota report that the Minnesota Commission had done, and it's from ICF and also funded by DOE. But this is a nice diagram that shows how a number of different processes can feed together, including forecasting and hosting capacity, locational benefits, and really all resulting in this distribution investment roadmap. All right, so this is the end of our formal presentation. I'm going to turn it back over to Lisa to cover one more slide, and then we'll open it up for questions. And I'll read some questions for the panelists.
Great, thanks, Juliet. So we just wanted to let folks know about training that we've been conducting for states on distribution systems and planning. So last year, my lab, Berkeley Lab, and the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners convened an advisory group from diverse states to talk about, what are the distribution system planning needs for public utility commissions, and help guide a training program. And then we partnered with Pacific Northwest National Lab and National Renewable Energy Lab and got sponsorship from U.S. Department of Energy to conduct 3 regional trainings. And so Julia will be posting the slides so you can get these, grab these hyperlinks for the agenda and slides for all the technical topics we covered in New England, the Midwest, and in the West most recently. And then we've expanded the training to include state energy offices, and soon we'll be starting up training for the National Association of State Utility Consumer Advocates. And then we hope in fiscal year 19 to be able to provide training for some of the regions that we've missed in the first year, Mid-Atlantic and South, and also pick up the state energy offices and others that we may have missed in the first round. Thanks, Juliet.
All right, you're welcome, Lisa. And actually, there's another question came in that's very similar to what you were just talking about. It says, can you say more about the Solar Energy Technologies Office, PUC, analytical support opportunities? And I'll just say that, the Solar Energy Technologies Office has started a 3-year analytical support program for PUCs for topics related to distribution system planning, regulatory issues, policy, and technical assessments. And so there was an application period that ended back in October 2017, and there's going to be another application period late summer, and that'll be solicited. So if folks are interested in that, they can contact one of us or just look for that solicitation later in the summer. Okay, so let's see. Alan, here's a question for you. Does a state with low or nearly no rooftop solar being installed need to consider grid modernization? Is it overkill or gold plating?
Excuse me. Interesting question. I would say it's not considered overkill and it's not considered gold plating. The basic reason being that grid modernization is kind of an umbrella term, and it covers a lot of components. It's not just integrating solar, it's not just integrating renewable energy, but it's also equipment, new, shall we say, smart equipment, to use that overused word, that will help utilities figure out where problems are, fault isolation, so that instead of sending somebody out who has to drive the length of a distribution line, they can pretty much send a truck out right to where the problem is, or somewhere really close to it. So there are things like that that are rolled in under grid modernization. And if you think about the list that I had from Hawaii, there are a lot of other things like cybersecurity, making data available, especially in states that have retail choice, making data available to other stakeholders while still protecting privacy and maintaining cybersecurity. There are a lot of elements of grid modernization that just fits no matter what state you're in. So no, it's not an either-or question at all.
Okay, excellent. Lisa, this one's for you. Have energy advocates begun to regularly participate in the state PUC proceedings on distribution planning and cost recovery?
Well, of course, state public utility commissions provide opportunities for parties to comment on utilities filed distribution system plans and, the component analyses that we've been talking about, like hosting capacity analysis, locational benefits analysis. And, the parties can also comment as states are developing their distribution system planning requirements. So whether it's through a rulemaking or some other proceeding, there are opportunities for stakeholders to engage and recommend what the requirements might look like, including opportunities for stakeholder engagement before the plan, if annual or biennial, before they're even filed. And, I'd say, in terms of our energy advocates, regularly participating in these proceedings after the requirements are in place in the utility files plan. Some parties clearly are, like solar PV and storage providers, they're engaging, and we've seen some environmental groups participating, but this is a really new technical area for traditional public utility commission interveners like consumer advocates. So I'm pleased that the U.S. Department of Energy is funding this new training for the National Association of State Utility Consumer Advocates, which I think will help there.
Okay, excellent. Another question, Lisa, this is for you too. What are the barriers to utilities' interest in pursuing non-wires alternatives? And how can we get over those barriers?
Well, you know, I mean, to the extent that these are foregone opportunities for capital investments for utilities with opportunity to earn a return on the investment, I think that can pose a barrier. But there are also technical barriers. You know, to the extent that utility hasn't tried to use a battery at the end of a line to sort of address their issue there. You know, they haven't tested that. They haven't tested using demand response and energy efficiency as a way to meet load relief on a circuit. I think those are some of the barriers. And so, you know, I can point toward California's pilot utility incentive program, where on a pilot basis, they were providing a 4% incentive for the capital cost of customer-owned or third-party-owned non-wires alternatives. So that's certainly something to take a look at and evaluate after that project is done. And then, you know, just doing other kinds of pilots, just trying out for certain applications to see whether a combination of energy efficiency, demand response, storage can work to defer certain types of traditional needs. I think once utilities get some experience, we can get over some of these barriers.
Okay, thank you. So let's see here. There was a note that some states have grid modernization proceedings underway, but no requirements yet. And there was a question that are other states just waiting for these grid modernization states to work out the bugs? Are some states taking a slower or piecemeal approach? And Alan, maybe I'll send that one to you. There's some states that already have requirements and some that are in development. So are some states just kind of waiting, sitting back and waiting to see how this goes and getting the bugs worked out?
You know, there could be a little bit of this sitting back and watching the other states, you know, waiting to get the bugs worked out. I think that most states are probably moving forward with the pieces that are important to them. I know that just from looking around the country that there are a lot of states that are really focusing on resiliency, and which in my opinion falls squarely under the grid modernization, because a lot of the tools that we're talking about are aiming at resiliency. I do think that a lot of it comes back to that where I started my presentation today, which is the context really matters. You know, I think a lot of states are holding back on some things because they don't, you know, if you're not seeing a lot of solar going in, you know, there's the question of, well, you know, what do we really need to do? So there might be a little bit of that going on. There might be some, but I think a lot of it really is states are just focusing on what's important to them. And that's just what it comes down to.
Okay. Let's see. So here's another one for Lisa. Why are some utilities requesting cost recovery for grid modernization investments outside of traditional rate cases?
Well, you know, where legislation allows it, you know, the utilities can get more timely cost recovery, which is important. And just as important, more certainty of cost recovery for these investments, some of which are large. So, you know, those are sort of the plus sides for a state that wants to see accelerated investment in grid modernization technologies. I think on the downside, that review may be streamlined and constrained by law, in fact, what can be looked at and what's not. And the review is done in the absence of review of other investments and expenses as would occur in a general rate case. So I think, you know, there could be some concerns on the part of consumer advocates in that respect. But, you know, long-term distribution system planning can help by making transparent upfront the whole suite of investments that a utility plans to make, say, in the next 5 or 10 years.
Okay. Thank you. Another question here. Could you elaborate on the difference between distribution resource planning and distribution system planning? And I'll take that one. And I think distribution resources planning is the term that California has been using for its process to look at kind of distribution resources and DERs. And I think other states use different terminology. But I think in general, distribution system planning is considered more traditional types of planning for meeting load growth, and kind of just traditional distribution system planning that's what DSP, or distribution system planning. But I think distribution resource planning kind of harkens back to kind of integrated resource planning, which is really about looking at all the alternatives in more of a kind of a holistic and integrated way. And so I think some states would, instead of saying distribution resource planning, will talk about integrated distribution system planning. So it's kind of a linguistic thing, but I think distribution resource planning assumes kind of a broader suite of alternatives are being considered, and it's more integrated between distribution systems and kind of generation and all the different parts there. All right, and then maybe the last question here for Alan. Are most requirements for distribution system planning and grid modernization planning coming from PUCs, or are some of them actually coming from the legislature itself in states?
Well, some of them are coming from the legislature. California's legislature kicked off a lot of what you see going on in California, and I know in some other states the legislature has put specific requirements. I think Minnesota, for example, put specific grid modernization requirements on Excel, one utility within the state. But from what I can tell anyway, a large percentage of what you see is coming from the public utility commissions, or the public service commissions within the states, as they try to grapple with what's going on with respect to things like the renewable portfolio standards, trying to figure out how to put those into place while still keeping the utility system financially and physically sound, to keep the reliability where it needs to be. So I think the majority of what I'm familiar with is probably coming from the regulatory commissions within the states.
Okay. Very good. Well, I want to thank you, Alan and Lisa, for participating, and thanks to everybody who called in. We are here. There's resources. As you see, our emails are on the screen. If you have further questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. And thanks again to DOE for funding this work. And everybody, have a great day. Thank you.